Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Lou. Faculty, colleagues, Monica, thank you for being here. Thank you all for just the love, the warmth, the welcome, and the realness that this place exhibits on a daily basis. Um, it means a lot, and it gives me the kind of confirmation of the confidence that I had based on a suspicion when looking and considering this place. And now I understand why I had that suspicion. So thank you all for being here. I want to talk about misunderstood miracles today. We've heard the text that was read. Thank you, Ray, for being willing to read that into our hearing. And it's a familiar passage. I assume one that we've all become quite familiar with. This is the famous story, one of two in Matthew, where Jesus, after hearing the news of John the Baptist being killed, seeks asylum in a deserted place, only to be met by a crowd who had heard about his healings and his teachings. And so they wanted to see what all the fuss was about. And despite the solitude he was seeking, he obliged, healing the sick late into the evening. We know the story. The disciples raised the concern to say it's getting late and the people are hungry, the stores are closed, send them home so they can go eat. Jesus says, no, then feed them. We don't need to send them home. He says, feed them with this kind of obvious tone as if they should have already known how to make this happen. It was a duh moment. But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus. Bring it here. Let me. And so then what ensues, he instructs the crowd to take a seat on the grass, as if to signal to the disciples, this is a teaching moment. Let me demonstrate something for you. He takes the loaves and the fish, blesses it, breaks the bread, then passes it to the disciples, who then pass it to the people. And somehow, everybody not only got a sample, but had their fill, and there were leftovers. 5,000 people, minus women and children, of course. Scholars agree that there might have been a little bit of hyperbole in the number, that the exaggeration probably mirrors 45's default ways of representing the number of people in the inauguration crowds. The point is, there were a lot of people present, and minus women and children, of course, more than should have logically been able to eat off of 5 loaves and 2 fish. In other words, this wasn't just any miracle. This wasn't just any healing. This wasn't just any narrative where Jesus cured the sick. This was what scholars call a nature miracle. In other words, a manipulation of something that should not happen, as if to point to Jesus being much more than a prophet, like many in the community thought he was. There's a unique theological significance built within this text. Scholars situate this text in a way that puts Jesus in a kind of historical and eschatological sandwich. On one hand, the allusions to Israel's journey through the wilderness by being fed in a miraculous way in the midst of the wilderness in a deserted place echoes the Exodus narrative, and paints a picture of Jesus as kind of this new Moses, this fulfillment of this divine promise that Israel would become a great nation. And at the same time, couched between this eschatological vision of the kingdom that was previously thought to be afar off, but now has dawned in the presence and the power of this nature miracle. If Jesus can do this, the kingdom must be at hand. So he's simultaneously put between this historical remembrance and this eschatological vision for the future that really tries to paint this. Matthew is trying to give us a clear picture of the real significance of what Jesus has just done. And yet, none of that explains what happened in the gap between verse 19 and verse 20. Verse 19 says, then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Fast forward to verse 20. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over and the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. I don't know about mealtime in your house, but there's a big block of time. And if you ask Monica, she'll tell you mealtime is not that quick. It's not that simple in our house. Ella, sit down. Ella, eat your food. Ella, stop playing. Ella, get back on the chair. Mealtime is a whole production in our residence. And I submit to you today that we have gotten so familiar with this text that we pass by this big block of time between verses 19 and 20. You look at the passages around these two scriptures, there's this movement of time, right? There's not really significant gaps until you get to 19 and 20. Something is left out as if we're supposed to know what happened. So there's this obvious tone again, this duh kind of assumption built within the text. We assume that Jesus somehow manipulated the elements, that he turned 2 fish and 5 loaves into enough for people not only to have a taste, but to have an excess. But the text never says that. There's a gap of time, and the text never says that Jesus did anything to the elements. All the text says is that he started passing it, and then everybody ate. I think maybe the reason that we don't know what happened is because we have a problem entering stories through the lenses of the protagonist. If we don't enter it through Jesus because we know we're not Jesus, we enter it through this God's kind of vision, this bird's eye view of the text, and we fail to enter it through the other characters that might shed light on what is taking place in this text. What if we entered the story through the disciples? Well, maybe that would tell us something, but I don't know that it would tell us everything. But what if we entered the story through the women? The unnamed, unacknowledged, seemingly insignificant women in this story that the text continually reminds us weren't counted in the 5,000, much less the children. 5,000 minus women and children, of course. Because women in this day and age were considered just to be property, right? So of course this story won't be told from their perspective, just like the revolutionary stories of so many women, people of color, and others deemed to be insignificant in the world today, people who are routinely silenced. These seemingly insignificant women, and yet they bore the greatest responsibility of anybody in this narrative, minus Jesus, maybe. You see, you think about this historical weight put on this miracle from Exodus, and you see this foreshadowing significance of the coming of the kingdom of God and kingdom of heaven all culminate in this moment. And we focus on Jesus. But the women were the ones who had the responsibility not only for the home, but also for the kids. And if you think about Israel's narrative, much of the divine promise hinged, it was predicated on having kids, namely a son, so that the son could be raised and we could become a great nation among nations. Well, the men weren't doing that. The men weren't taking care of the kids. The men weren't nurturing the kids in a way that these seemingly insignificant women had and bore the responsibility for. What might enter in the story through their eyes tell us about what happened between verses 19 and 20? Do we not assume that these women, these seemingly insignificant and objectified women who bore this great eschatological and historical responsibility, unacknowledged, but yet bore this responsibility, do we not assume that they would have not gone, they would have gone to the wilderness unprepared? We don't even leave the house with Ella without taking snacks. And if I'm going to the wilderness and it's late and I'm going to listen to this man preach who has apparently been healing and curing the sick, so this isn't going to be a 15-minute sermon. We're going to be here for a while. Do we not assume that these women would not have had that concern in mind when they went to the wilderness? I submit to you today that they were not only prepared, these women were more than prepared. You see, they were the ones who brought the food that contributed to the feast in which everybody ate and had their fill. Let me bust that open for you a little bit. David Goatley, my theology professor at Central Baptist Theological Seminary, dropped a bomb on us one night when we were having an intensive class. It was late in the evening, we were getting ready to leave, and somehow this text came up. If you know David Goatley, you know a lot of his ministry is on international missions. He spends a lot of time in Africa, spends a lot of time in everywhere all over the world doing mission work and hearing from and listening to people in these different communities. And one of the conversations that he told us about was about this text and how they were reading this text in this African community where these African women approached this text in a kind of lens that said, duh. Because while people were trying to figure out this miracle, the women immediately upon reading this text, it didn't take scholarly history, it didn't take any of that for these women to be able to identify, well, if I'm going to the desert with my kids, I'm going to have rations with me. And so sometimes I think, I didn't plan this part, but listen, sometimes we can become so sophisticated, that oh no, it's my amen corner there. Sometimes we can become so sophisticated that we forget to listen to the wisdom of the elders. We forget to listen to the wisdom that comes out of places of oppression. We can forget to listen to the wise words that comes out of people that we forget to listen to because we get so smart. Through the eyes of these women, we see the obvious nature that the real miracle was perhaps not a capitalistic kind of multiplication of the elements that left the people the same. A different picture emerges when we enter this story through the eyes of women. Perhaps it wasn't a multiplication at all. Perhaps the miracle was in Jesus' ability, based on the preparation of these women, to illustrate for the crowd in a transformative way how easily they could take care of each other. A picture emerges where I see Jesus breaking this bread and he passes it to the disciples, who then pass it to the people, who then keep passing it. And as they're passing it, these women realize what's happening. So they take out their rations and start passing it, to which somebody else takes out what they brought and starts passing it. And eventually there's a feast when there was only two fish and 5 loaves. And the disciples couldn't see it because they were focused on Jesus. But the women in this story knew what Jesus was doing. And it gives some meat to the duh assumptions in this text. Jesus knew something, and these women were on the same page. The disciples missed it. They'd gotten too sophisticated and too smart and focused on the wrong things. And so these women bring out what they brought, what they had prepared for a moment such as this. And eventually, not only do they have enough, but there's leftovers. There's more than enough. What are you saying, preacher? I'm suggesting to you that United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, this seemingly insignificant, small little learning community, often unacknowledged in the midst of a world where seminaries are closing their doors every single day, has managed to survive, not by luck, not because we have something, we've figured it out, not a product of sophistication. I mean, yes, there's strategy, but that's not why we're still here. We're prepared. There's something that we have to offer the world that ends up to where everybody has an excess. We lean into these gifts and these unique talents that we bring to the world, and we move from trying to exist to survive to trying to exist to produce. Existing to remake reality, existing not to hoard students, not simply to attract students, but to allow students to see what we are doing, allow students to see the ways that we're changing reality in a moment and a moment and a moment, disrupting the routines of oppression, of dehumanization, and offering the world new possibilities for the ways that we might remake reality through our relational performances, the ways that we relate to each other, disrupting the patterns of the ways people relate to young Black men, disrupting the patterns of the ways people relate to women, disrupting the ways people relate to LGBT communities, disrupting the ways people relate to all of these communities that find solitude in this place. People that know that if I want to go somewhere where my voice can be heard, I'm going to United. People that know that if I want to go somewhere where I can dance and play with ideas in a way that certain places like Princeton or Yale or all of these wonderful places won't allow you to do, I'm going to go to United. Why? Because it's not about simply surviving. If we exist to survive, we will die a slow death. But if we exist to remake reality, to transform these world that we live with, based on the fact that we are prepared, and on the realization that God's divine plan is contingent on our participation, survival won't even be a question. I invite you today to not only remember those in our society that are seemingly insignificant, but also for us to lean into the way that we have more than what we need, and for that to be what we focus on moving forward. God bless you.